Clara Whitmore never thought the end of her marriage would sound so quiet. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, no dramatic confession, just the soft click of keys placed on the marble kitchen counter, right beside her coffee mug that had already gone cold. Ethan stood there in his tailored jacket, phone in hand, notifications lighting up the screen like nothing in the world was falling apart. 2 days earlier, they had attended a business dinner together. 2 days earlier, he had smiled for photos, his arm resting casually around her waist. 2 days earlier, she still believed they were a team. Now he cleared his throat and said the sentence that would fracture her life. "I think this marriage has run its course." Clara didn't answer right away. She waited for the rest of the explanation, the apology, the hesitation. It never came. Ethan spoke calmly as if he were ending a subscription, not a decade-long relationship. "I've changed," he added, "and I need a different environment to grow." Different environment, different life, different woman. Though he didn't say that part out loud. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, filling the silence he refused to acknowledge. Clara felt her chest tighten, but no tears came. Shock has a strange way of freezing the body. She noticed small details instead. The faint reflection of Manhattan's skyline through the window, the way Ethan adjusted his cufflinks, the vibration of his iPhone buzzing with another work email. "So, that's it?" she finally asked. Ethan nodded. "I'll stay at a hotel for a few days. We'll talk logistics later." Logistics. As if love could be boxed, labelled, and scheduled. He picked up his keys and hesitated for half a second, not long enough to change his mind, just long enough to convince himself he wasn't a villain. Then he walked out, the door closing with a soft, definitive click. Clara stood alone in the apartment they had built together, the furniture she had chosen, the view she had learned to love, the life she had quietly supported while putting her own ambitions on pause. The silence pressed against her ears until it became unbearable. She walked to the window and stared down at the street below. Cars moved, people laughed. Somewhere, a siren wailed. The world hadn't noticed her collapse. What Clara didn't know, what Ethan couldn't possibly imagine, was that this moment, this cold and careless ending, would not destroy her the way he expected. It would change the trajectory of both their lives, because sometimes when a man walks away too easily, he doesn't realize he's leaving behind more than a wife. He's walking away from his future. The first night without Ethan felt unreal. Clara lay awake on her side of the bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the unfamiliar quiet. His pillow still held the faint scent of his cologne, and for a moment, her body betrayed her mind. She reached out instinctively only to feel cold fabric and empty space. That was when the truth finally began to sink in. But the loss didn't stop at her marriage. The next morning, her phone buzzed before sunrise. It wasn't a message from Ethan. It was an email from her company's HR department, carefully worded and painfully polite. Due to recent restructuring, her position was being eliminated. They thanked her for her years of contribution and wished her well in her future endeavours. Clara read the email twice, then a third time, hoping she had misunderstood. She hadn't. Within 24 hours, she had lost her husband and her job. By noon, the whispers started. A former colleague texted her awkwardly, asking if she was doing okay. Another unfollowed her on social media. Friends she had hosted for dinners and birthdays suddenly became unreachable. When she checked her phone, she realized Ethan's version of the story had already made its rounds. Subtle, polished, and devastating. He hadn't called her unstable. He hadn't insulted her directly. He had done something far more effective. He had framed her as unnecessary. She just didn't fit the direction anymore. That sentence followed her everywhere. Clara walked through the apartment slowly, as if the walls themselves were judging her. Every corner reminded her of choices she had made for him. Opportunities declined, late nights supporting his projects, introductions she had facilitated quietly in the background. She had believed sacrifice would be remembered. Instead, it had been erased. In the afternoon, she stepped outside and wandered toward Central Park, without a destination. The city moved fast around her, indifferent and unforgiving. Couples laughed, businessmen checked their watches. Life went on, cruelly intact. For the first time, fear crept in. Not the fear of being alone, but the fear of becoming invisible. She sat on a bench, hands trembling slightly, and asked herself a question she had avoided for years. If I am not his wife, who am I? Clara didn't cry then. She couldn't afford to. Something inside her understood that whatever came next would require clarity, not collapse. Still, as the sun dipped behind the buildings, she felt the weight of everything she had lost settle heavily on her chest. And somewhere across the city, Ethan believed this was the beginning of her downfall. He had no idea it was the beginning of her awakening. Clara found out about Vanessa the same way most betrayals are discovered now, through a screen. It was late afternoon when her phone vibrated with a notification she hadn't expected. An old acquaintance had tagged Ethan in a photo. Clara didn't open it at first. She already knew she shouldn't. But curiosity has a cruel way of overpowering dignity. The image loaded slowly. Ethan stood on a rooftop overlooking Fifth Avenue, champagne glass in hand. His arm wrapped around a woman Clara had never seen before. Vanessa Cole. That was the name beneath the photo, followed by a caption filled with laughing emojis and a careless line about new beginnings. Vanessa was stunning in an effortless way. Designer dress, glossy hair, confidence sharpened by the certainty of victory. She leaned into Ethan as if she belonged there, as if Clara had never existed. Clara's stomach dropped. This wasn't a secret affair discovered months later. This was public, deliberate, announced, only days after Ethan walked out of their marriage. The comments were worse than the photo itself. So happy for you. You deserve this. Finally with someone who matches your level. Clara read them in silence, each sentence slicing deeper than the last. No one asked where she was. No one questioned the timing. The story had already been written, and she had been edited out with surgical precision. Later that evening, fate twisted the knife further. Clara spotted them in person. She had stopped by a cafe near Central Park, hoping a familiar place might ground her. As she turned to leave, she saw Ethan and Vanessa entering the sidewalk restaurant across the street. Vanessa laughed loudly, her hand resting possessively on Ethan's chest. He leaned in, attentive, proud. Then Vanessa noticed Clara. Their eyes met for a brief, unbearable second. Vanessa didn't look away. She smiled, not kindly, not awkwardly, but with quiet triumph. Ethan followed her gaze and froze. For a moment, something flickered across his face, guilt perhaps, or discomfort, but it vanished quickly. He straightened his posture and placed his hand more firmly around Vanessa's waist, making a choice without words. Clara understood then. This wasn't just about love or attraction. It was about replacement, about proving something, about erasing her completely. She walked away before they could say a word. Her hands were steady, but her chest burned. She felt exposed, like the city itself had watched her be discarded. That night, alone in her apartment, Clara stared at her reflection and realized something painful and undeniable. She hadn't just lost her husband, she had lost her position in the story he was telling the world, and she was about to learn how dangerous that could be. If losing Ethan felt like an earthquake, what came next felt like the ground giving way entirely. Rachel Moore had been Clara's closest friend for nearly 7 years. They had shared holidays, late-night phone calls, inside jokes about people they pretended to like. When Ethan left, Rachel was the first person Clara called. The first person who showed up with groceries and quiet sympathy. The first person who hugged her without asking questions. That was why Clara didn't hesitate when Rachel suggested coffee. They met at a small cafe near Central Park, the kind of place Clara used to love. Rachel listened attentively as Clara spoke in fragments, careful not to sound bitter, careful not to fall apart. Rachel nodded, squeezed her hand, and said all the right things. "He never deserved you," she whispered. Clara almost believed it. Later that night, an email landed in Clara's inbox by accident. Or at least, that's how it felt. It was a forwarded message from someone in her former office, clearly not meant for her eyes. The subject line mentioned her name, followed by words that made her stomach drop. She's emotionally unstable right now. She couldn't handle pressure. It's better she's no longer involved. The language was familiar, too familiar. Clara scrolled down slowly and found the source. The message had been compiled from private conversations. Details only one person outside her marriage knew. Comments she had shared with Rachel in moments of exhaustion and trust. Her hands shook as understanding set in. Rachel hadn't just listened. She had reported. Filtered Clara's vulnerability into ammunition. Passed it along to Ethan, to colleagues, to anyone shaping the narrative of why Clara had been removed from both marriage and career. When Clara confronted her, Rachel didn't deny it. "I was trying to help," she said softly over the phone. "You were too emotional. People needed context." Context. Another word that burned. Clara hung up without responding. There was nothing left to say. The betrayal was complete, not dramatic, not explosive, just cold and efficient. Rachel had chosen proximity to power over loyalty, and she had done it without remorse. That night, Clara sat alone on the edge of her bed, staring at the city lights. Something inside her shifted. The pain didn't disappear, but it hardened into clarity. She finally understood why everything had collapsed so quickly. It hadn't been coincidence, it had been coordination. And for the first time since Ethan walked out, Clara stopped wondering what she had done wrong. She started asking a different question. What would happen if she stopped trusting the wrong people? The humiliation didn't arrive loudly. It arrived dressed as normal life. 2 days after Clara discovered Rachel's betrayal, her phone began to buzz again. This time it wasn't gossip from strangers or awkward check-ins from former colleagues. It was news alerts, photos, headlines that pretended to be neutral while quietly choosing a side. Ethan Whitmore was photographed attending a private charity gala at the Plaza Hotel. He wasn't alone. Vanessa stood beside him in a sleek black dress, her hand resting confidently on his arm. They smiled for the cameras like a couple who had nothing to hide and nothing to regret. The article described her as a refreshing presence in Ethan's life. Clara wasn't mentioned at all, not even as an afterthought. Clara stared at the screen, her reflection faintly visible over the image. It felt as if the city had collectively decided she no longer existed. She wasn't the wronged wife. She wasn't the woman who had sacrificed years of her life. She was simply erased. That evening, she made the mistake of leaving her apartment. She needed air, distance, something solid to remind her she was still real. As she walked past the hotel entrance, she saw the glow of lights spilling onto the sidewalk, heard laughter floating through open doors. And then she saw them. Ethan and Vanessa stepped outside, surrounded by people who admired them. Vanessa laughed, tossing her hair back, completely at ease. Ethan looked relaxed, successful, untouched by consequence. Someone nearby recognized Clara. The whisper spread quickly. That's his ex-wife. Clara felt every eye shift toward her. Some curious, some pitying, some openly judgmental. No one spoke to her, but the silence was loud enough. She suddenly understood what it meant to lose status without committing a crime. She turned and walked away, her face calm, her heart pounding. By the time she reached her apartment, the composure shattered. Her legs gave out, and she slid down against the door, finally letting the tears come. It wasn't just heartbreak anymore. It was grief for the life she had built and the identity she had lost. The city that once felt full of promise now felt hostile, crowded with reminders of everything taken from her. Clara stayed on the floor for a long time, breathing through the weight pressing on her chest. And when she finally stood up, wiping her face, a quiet decision settled in. If Manhattan was going to watch her fall, it would not get to watch her break. By morning, Clara Whitmore would begin to disappear. Clara didn't announce her departure. There was no dramatic goodbye, no final post, no message explaining herself. By the time the city woke up, she was already gone. Her apartment keys sat neatly on the counter. The closets were half empty. The life she had lived so publicly had been folded away with deliberate care. She left Manhattan before sunrise. The city looked different from the back seat of the car, quieter and almost kind, as if it didn't know yet that she was slipping away. Clara watched the skyline fade, feeling neither relief nor panic, only a strange calm she hadn't felt in months. Disappearing, she realized, wasn't about running. It was about reclaiming silence. Her new place was small and intentionally forgettable. No skyline views. No polished lobbies. Just a clean space with light that fell gently across the floor in the morning. She bought groceries from a nearby store, brewed her own coffee, and let the days slow down enough for her thoughts to catch up. For the first time since the divorce, Clara slept through the night. She spent her mornings reading, not to escape, but to rebuild her inner voice. Meditations by Marcus Aurelius lay open on the table, its pages marked and worn. In the afternoons, she wrote, not emails, not apologies, but plans. On her MacBook Air, she mapped out every skill she had buried beneath years of compromise: strategy, communication, pattern recognition, decision-making under pressure. She hadn't lost those things. She had just stopped using them for herself. The world, meanwhile, moved on without her. Ethan noticed her absence in the way one notices silence after noise, briefly, then dismissively. When mutual acquaintances asked about Clara, he shrugged. She needed space, he said. She wasn't handling things well. The narrative stayed intact. Clara stayed invisible, but invisibility gave her something she hadn't had before: freedom. Each day, the ache in her chest softened, not because the pain disappeared, but because it no longer controlled her. She began to understand that healing wasn't dramatic. It wasn't poetic. It was repetitive, quiet, and deeply personal. Clara wasn't rebuilding her old life. She was designing a new one that required no permission, no explanation, and no one's approval. And while the people who had underestimated her believed she was still falling apart, Clara was doing something far more dangerous. She was becoming unrecognizable. Clara didn't tell anyone when the first opportunity came. It arrived without drama, tucked inside a short email sent from an unfamiliar address. No logo, no grand promises, just a question written plainly. I was given your name. Are you available for a short strategy review? She stared at the screen for a long moment before replying. Not because she doubted her ability, but because she understood what this represented. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't a comeback. It was something far more fragile. A beginning. Clara answered professionally, carefully. She didn't mention her past role, her former marriage, or the months she had spent unraveling and rebuilding herself. She simply asked what problem needed solving. The call happened 2 days later. She listened more than she spoke, her notebook filling with patterns she recognized instantly: inefficiencies, misaligned incentives, decisions made for optics rather than outcomes. When she finally offered her perspective, there was a pause on the other end of the line. That's not what anyone else said, the voice replied, but it makes sense. When the call ended, Clara closed her laptop and sat still, her heart racing, not from fear but from recognition. She was good at this. She had always been good. She had just forgotten what it felt like to be heard. The payment arrived the following week, modest, clean, unquestioned. Clara didn't celebrate. She didn't even tell herself it meant anything yet. Instead, she did something small and symbolic. She bought a simple citizen watch. Nothing extravagant. No brand statement. Just a reminder that time belonged to her again. As days passed, more messages followed. Quiet referrals, short-term consultations. Each one came from someone who didn't know her story and didn't need to. They judged her solely on clarity, precision, and results. Meanwhile, life in Manhattan continued without her. Ethan moved freely through rooms where Clara's influence had once been invisible but essential. Vanessa laughed loudly at dinners she hadn't earned. Rachel went on as if nothing had happened. They believed the chapter was closed. Clara didn't correct them. At night, she reviewed her notes, sipping coffee in the dim light, her MacBook open to plans that grew sharper with each revision. She wasn't chasing revenge. She wasn't trying to be seen. She was building leverage. And though the world still believed Clara Whitmore had faded into irrelevance, the truth was far more dangerous. She had just taken her first step forward. Quietly, deliberately, and entirely on her own terms. Clara didn't use her real name. That decision came easily, without hesitation. Not out of fear, but out of strategy. When the next inquiry arrived, she replied under a shortened version of her middle name. No last name, no digital footprint, just results. The work grew quickly after that. She was brought into conversations already failing, meetings where executives spoke confidently while missing the real problem entirely. Clara listened. She always listened. Then she asked the question no one else dared to ask. Why are you protecting the wrong metric? Silence usually followed. Then discomfort. Then clarity. Clients didn't know who she used to be. They didn't care. To them, she was simply the person who untangled what others complicated, the one who saw patterns before they became disasters, the one who didn't need to raise her voice to be taken seriously. Each engagement ended the same way. A pause, then a quiet sentence. Can we keep working together? Clara kept her routine simple. Mornings were spent reviewing data, afternoons in strategy calls, evenings refining frameworks she had once built for Ethan's benefit without credit. Now she kept everything documented, every contribution traceable. No more disappearing labor. Meanwhile, the world she had left behind remained convinced of its version of events. Ethan told people Clara had checked out after the divorce. Vanessa laughed along, adding that some women just weren't built for pressure. Rachel repeated those words in rooms where Clara's absence made them believable. No one noticed that deals were stalling, that strategies were missing something, that the invisible engine they once relied on was gone. Clara noticed. She tracked the ripple effects quietly, not out of bitterness, but awareness. Systems reveal their weaknesses when key parts are removed. Watching that process felt oddly impersonal, almost academic. One evening, an unfamiliar name appeared in her inbox. Julian Hayes. The email was brief and direct. I've been following the outcomes of your recent work. I'd like to talk. No flattery, no assumptions, just curiosity. Clara didn't respond immediately. She reread the message twice, noting what wasn't there. No probing questions, no references to her past, no attempt to place her. She smiled faintly and closed her laptop. For the first time since everything fell apart, she felt something shift. Not hope, not excitement, momentum. While the people who underestimated her continued to move loudly and recklessly, Clara was building something invisible and precise, and invisibility, she had learned, wasn't weakness. It was cover. Clara agreed to the meeting on one condition: no background questions, no personal history, no assumptions. Julian Hayes accepted without hesitation. They met in a quiet private dining room on the Upper East Side, a place chosen not for luxury but discretion. The restaurant was nearly empty, the kind of space where conversations stayed contained and egos weren't on display. Julian arrived on time. Early, actually. He stood when she entered. Polite but unremarkable, dressed simply. No visible need to impress. That alone told Clara more than most resumes ever could. "I won't waste your time," he said once they sat down. "I've watched 3 companies change direction after your involvement, not publicly, but effectively." Clara didn't react. She waited. Julian slid a folder across the table. No branding, no dramatic reveal. Just numbers, timelines, decisions reversed at critical moments, evidence of impact without attribution. "You don't insert yourself into the spotlight," he continued. "You correct the course, then disappear." "That's rare," Clara finally spoke. "I don't believe in noise." Julian smiled, not impressed but aligned. "Neither do I." He explained his position carefully. Founder of a private investment firm, long-term strategies, quiet capital, the kind of work that required patience and precision, not ego or theatrics. "I'm not offering you a job," he said. "I'm offering you a partnership, conditional, observational, earned." That word landed differently. Partnership, not rescue, not opportunity framed as charity, just recognition. Clara felt something tighten in her chest. Not fear, but caution. She had learned the cost of trust. Still, she asked the only question that mattered. "Why me?" Julian didn't answer immediately. He looked out the window for a moment, watching the city move below. "Because you don't confuse control with power," he said. "And because people who've lost everything tend to see systems more clearly." There was no pity in his voice, only respect. They talked for another hour. Strategy, risk, boundaries. What success looked like when it wasn't announced, when they stood to leave. There was no handshake that promised too much, just a simple agreement to start small. As Clara walked back into the street, the city felt different again. Not hostile, not welcoming, neutral. For the first time since disappearing, she wasn't just building leverage, she was no longer alone in seeing the board. And somewhere deep inside, Clara understood this meeting would change the balance. Not loudly, not immediately, but permanently. From the outside, Ethan Whitmore's life looked flawless. The photos told a simple, convincing story. Champagne glasses raised at rooftop parties. A new Mercedes parked beneath soft city lights. Vanessa at his side, elegant and radiant, her smile perfectly framed for every camera. To anyone scrolling past, it looked like success rewarded, like a man who had made the right choice at the right time. Ethan believed it too. He told people the divorce had been necessary, inevitable, a step forward. Clara, he explained calmly, had grown distant, unfocused. She hadn't been able to keep up with the pace his life required. The story was neat, efficient, and, most importantly, believable. When acquaintances asked about her, he waved the question away. "She needed time," he said. "Some people just aren't built for pressure." Vanessa echoed the sentiment, laughing lightly as if it were all ancient history. "She'll figure it out eventually," she said, already bored with the subject. They didn't notice what was missing. The meetings that once flowed smoothly, now dragged on. Decisions stalled. Deals required more revisions than expected. Ethan found himself staying later, reviewing reports twice. Feeling a low-grade irritation he couldn't quite name. At night, he dismissed the discomfort with another glass of wine, another distraction. Success, after all, came with stress. That's what he told himself. One evening, as they prepared for a dinner party, Vanessa scrolled through her phone and frowned. "Why hasn't Clara said anything?" she asked suddenly. Ethan paused. "About what?" "About us. About everything." Vanessa shrugged. "Most women would be furious." Ethan smiled, a flicker of satisfaction warming his chest. "She's probably still processing, that's how she is." The idea comforted him. Clara, quiet and overwhelmed. Clara watching from the sidelines. Clara, exactly where he expected her to be. Across the city, invitations arrived bearing his name. Panels, conferences, exclusive gatherings where his presence was assumed. His value unquestioned. Ethan accepted them all, unaware that something subtle had shifted beneath his feet. He stood at the center of rooms filled with admiration, never realizing the structure that once supported him was no longer intact. Because while Ethan celebrated what he believed was victory, the truth was far less flattering. He hadn't won. He had simply not felt the consequences yet. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning. It looked ordinary at first, clean design, minimal language, nothing flashy. Ethan skimmed it between meetings, expecting another routine appearance or industry dinner. But halfway through the message, his attention sharpened. Private strategy session, selective attendance only. Park Avenue. That alone would have been enough to secure his interest. But it was the name listed beneath the agenda that made his breath hitch. Strategic partner, Clara Whitmore. Ethan reread the line, certain he had misunderstood. He blinked, scrolled back, read it again. The room suddenly felt smaller. His assistant hovered nearby, waiting for a response, unaware that something fundamental had just shifted. Ethan forced a smile, waved her off, and sat back in his chair. Clara Whitmore, his ex-wife, the woman he believed had disappeared quietly into irrelevance. This didn't make sense. She hadn't called. She hadn't resurfaced publicly. There had been no interviews, no announcements, no visible climb. And yet here she was, attached to an invitation he couldn't afford to ignore. Vanessa noticed the change immediately that evening. "You're distracted," she said, watching him loosen his tie. "Did something happen?" "Nothing," Ethan replied too quickly. "Just work." But the words echoed in his mind long after she fell asleep. Strategic partner. Not consultant. Not contributor. Partner. The night before the session, Ethan told himself it was a coincidence. A different Clara Whitmore, perhaps. A common name. A clerical error. Still, he arrived early. The conference room on Park Avenue was understated but precise. Glass walls, muted lighting, quiet confidence. Executives filtered in, exchanging measured greetings. Ethan scanned the room, his pulse steady but alert. Then the door opened. Clara walked in calmly, dressed simply, her posture composed, her presence undeniable. She didn't scan the room. She didn't hesitate. She moved as someone who belonged there. For a brief moment their eyes met. No anger, no accusation. Just recognition. Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. She took her seat at the head of the table, opened her notebook, and began speaking as if this were the most natural thing in the world. The clarity in her voice cut through the room effortlessly. People listened. They leaned in. Ethan sat frozen, realization crashing into him. Clara hadn't vanished. She had moved ahead. And for the first time since the divorce, Ethan understood something he had never considered. He had let go of far more than he realized. Ethan barely heard the rest of the presentation. Clara's voice carried through the room with quiet authority, outlining risks, reframing assumptions, dismantling flawed strategies with precision that felt surgical. She wasn't loud, she didn't perform. She simply spoke as someone who had done the work and expected others to keep up. The room responded immediately. Executives nodded. Questions were directed to her, not him. Decisions were deferred until she weighed in. Ethan felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest. Not jealousy, but displacement. He had always assumed he was the smartest person in the room. Today, he wasn't even the reference point. When the session ended, people gathered around Clara, thanking her, asking follow-up questions, scheduling next steps. Ethan remained seated for a moment too long, forcing himself to breathe evenly. Eventually, the room thinned. Clara stood alone near the window, reviewing notes. Ethan approached cautiously, unsure which version of himself should speak, the confident executive or the man who had walked away without looking back. "Clara," he said. She turned slowly, her expression neutral. Not cold, not warm. Just composed. "Ethan," she replied. No pause, no tremor. "I didn't know you were involved in this," he said, immediately regretting how small it sounded. "I didn't think it was relevant," Clara answered simply. The words landed harder than any accusation could have. Relevant. She hadn't hidden. She just hadn't informed him. Ethan searched her face for something familiar, resentment, pain, even satisfaction. He found none. What unsettled him most wasn't her success, but her detachment. She wasn't trying to prove anything. "You look well," he offered. Clara nodded. "I am." Silence stretched between them. For the first time since their separation, Ethan felt exposed. The assumptions he had carried, that she was struggling, that she needed time, that she would eventually reach out, collapsed under the weight of reality. "I didn't expect this," he admitted quietly. Clara met his gaze, steady and unflinching. "That was never my responsibility." She closed her notebook, signaling the end of the conversation. As she walked away, Ethan realized something chillingly clear. She wasn't here to confront him. She wasn't here to reclaim anything. She had moved so far beyond the point where his opinion mattered that he barely registered in her orbit. And as Ethan stood alone in the emptying room, the truth settled in with painful clarity. This wasn't a reunion, it was a reckoning. Vanessa had never planned for things to slow down. She was used to momentum, invitations that arrived without effort, reservations made in her name, doors opening because of who she was standing beside. With Ethan, life had moved fast and publicly, exactly the way she liked it. But after the Park Avenue meeting, something shifted. Ethan became distracted, quieter. His phone buzzed less often with good news. Dinners were postponed. Meetings ran long. When Vanessa asked questions, he brushed them off, insisting everything was under control. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Vanessa noticed everything. She noticed the cancelled trip, the hesitation before approving expenses, the way Ethan reread emails late into the night, jaw tight, shoulders tense. She had seen this pattern before, just not this close. One evening, she brought it up casually over dinner. "You've been off lately," she said, swirling her wine. "Is something wrong?" Ethan shook his head. "Just a complicated quarter." Vanessa nodded, but her mind was already calculating. Complicated quarters didn't last forever, but reputations did. And she had no intention of tying her future to someone whose trajectory was suddenly uncertain. Soon the cracks became harder to ignore. A deal she had bragged about fell through. Another stalled unexpectedly. People who once returned her messages instantly began responding with polite delays. Invitations thinned. The rooms grew quieter. Vanessa's patience thinned with them. She started questioning Ethan openly. Why wasn't he pushing harder? Why was Clara's name suddenly mentioned in conversations that used to revolve around him? Why did people listen to her? The answers irritated her. One night, after an argument that lingered too long, Vanessa made a decision. She didn't announce it, she simply stopped trying. The affection faded first, then the enthusiasm, then the presence. Ethan came home one evening to find her packing. Calm. Efficient. Already detached. "This isn't what I signed up for," she said evenly. "I need stability." Ethan watched her leave, stunned by the speed of it all. The irony hit him too late. The woman he had chosen for her image had chosen her image over him. By the end of the week, Vanessa had disappeared from his life as cleanly as she had entered it. And somewhere across the city, Clara continued working quietly, unaffected, unbothered, and entirely uninterested in the collapse unfolding behind her. Vanessa's exit wasn't dramatic, but it was definitive, and it marked the beginning of Ethan's real loss. Ethan didn't lose everything at once. That would have been easier to explain. Instead, the damage came in fragments, small, deniable moments that accumulated faster than he could control. A delayed response from a long-time client. A meeting rescheduled, then quietly reassigned. A proposal returned with too many red marks and not enough patience. At first, Ethan blamed timing, market conditions, bad luck, but excuses lose their power when patterns emerge. In rooms where he once led conversations, He now found himself interrupted. His suggestions were acknowledged politely, then set aside. Decisions moved forward without his input. It wasn't hostility. It was something far worse. Indifference. He began staying late, reviewing numbers that no longer aligned, trying to locate the missing variable. Somewhere between spreadsheets and half-empty coffee cups, the realizations surfaced, unwelcome and persistent. Clara had been doing more than he ever admitted. She hadn't just supported his work, she had stabilized it. Without her quiet corrections, small inefficiencies had grown into visible cracks. Strategies once refined effortlessly now felt blunt. The clarity he had taken for granted was gone. Ethan tried to compensate. He pushed harder, spoke louder, asserted authority where it used to be implied. The effort only made things worse. People noticed the strain. Confidence without foundation always reveals itself. The first contract fell through publicly. The second followed without explanation. By the third, no one needed reasons. His reputation didn't collapse. It eroded. Slowly enough that no one rushed to his defense, quickly enough that no one waited for him to recover. At home, the apartment felt cavernous. Vanessa was gone. The silence she left behind was sharper than loneliness. Ethan sat alone most nights, scrolling through old messages, searching for reassurance that never arrived. Once he opened Clara's contact, stared at it, closed it. Pride kept him silent. Fear kept him awake. Meanwhile, conversations he wasn't invited to continued without him. Deals he once influenced moved forward in new hands. His name, once spoken with confidence, began to sound optional. By the time Ethan accepted what was happening, it was already too late to reverse. He hadn't been sabotaged. He had been revealed. And as the walls he believed were permanent continued to crumble, one truth echoed louder than the rest. He didn't just lose Clara, he lost the version of himself that worked. Rachel Moore had always believed she was careful. She knew how to listen without committing, how to repeat stories without sounding responsible for them. When Clara's life collapsed, Rachel had convinced herself she was simply being practical, aligning with the stronger side, protecting her own position. At first, it worked. She stayed close to Ethan's circle. She was invited to meetings, included in conversations that mattered. People trusted her because she appeared neutral, helpful, informed. She told herself loyalty was a luxury and survival required flexibility. But flexibility has a cost. The mistake Rachel made was assuming Clara would stay invisible. When the Park Avenue deal went public and Clara's name appeared again, not as a footnote but as a strategic authority, people began to ask questions. Quiet ones, careful ones. The kind that unravel stories instead of confirming them. Someone reviewed old email threads. Someone else noticed inconsistencies in timelines. Comments Rachel had made months earlier no longer matched the reality unfolding now. The cracks widened quickly. During an internal review, a manager flagged confidential insights that had circulated too freely. Private conversations repackaged as professional assessments. Emotional details disguised as performance evaluations. The pattern was undeniable. Rachel was called into a meeting she didn't expect. The room was polite, calm, unemotional. They didn't accuse her. They didn't need to. They showed her the trail. Messages forwarded without permission, opinions framed as facts, information shared where it didn't belong. By the time Rachel opened her mouth to explain, the explanation no longer mattered. Trust, once broken, doesn't negotiate. She left the building carrying a box she hadn't prepared for. Colleagues avoided her eyes. Phones stopped buzzing. Invitations disappeared as quietly as they had once arrived. That evening she sat alone in her apartment, replaying every decision she had justified. Every moment she had chosen advantage over integrity. She realized then that she hadn't misjudged Clara's weakness. She had misjudged Clara's patience. Across the city, Clara remained unaware of the specifics. She didn't need updates. She didn't need validation. The systems she worked within corrected themselves naturally once truth replaced convenience. Rachel's fall wasn't loud. There were no headlines, no confrontations, just consequences. And as Rachel stared at the silence she had earned, one thought echoed painfully clear. Betrayal doesn't always feel like a crime. Until the bill comes due. Clara didn't wake up one morning suddenly happy. Happiness didn't arrive as a burst of joy or a dramatic realization. It came quietly, in pieces so small they were almost invisible. A steady calm replacing the constant tension she used to mistake for love. A sense of alignment she hadn't felt in years. She noticed it first in the absence of fear. There were no messages she dreaded opening, no rooms she entered wondering how she should behave, no careful calculations about how much space she was allowed to take. Her days moved with clarity, shaped by decisions she made for herself and no one else. Work no longer felt like survival. It felt intentional. Julian never rushed her. He never tested her boundaries or demanded reassurance. Their collaboration was built on mutual respect, not leverage. When Clara spoke, she was heard. When she set limits, they were accepted without negotiation. That alone felt revolutionary. One evening, after a long strategy session, they sat quietly in a private corner of a restaurant, the city glowing outside the window. Julian asked a simple question, one that caught her off guard. "Do you know why people trust you so quickly?" he asked. Clara considered it. "Because I do the work?" "That's part of it," he said. "But mostly because you're consistent. You don't perform. You don't manipulate outcomes. People feel safe around that." The word settled into her chest. Safe. She realized then how unsafe her old life had been. How often she had minimized herself to keep peace. How she had mistaken endurance for loyalty and silence for strength. Clara's happiness wasn't about winning or proving anything. It wasn't tied to Ethan's downfall or Rachel's exposure. Those events existed, but they no longer defined her emotional landscape. Her happiness came from sovereignty, from knowing she could walk away from anything that compromised her dignity, from trusting her instincts again, from choosing relationships, personal and professional, that expanded rather than consumed her. Late that night, Clara walked home alone, her steps unhurried. The city no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a place full of possibility, neutral and open. She understood something then that had taken years to learn. Peace isn't the reward for suffering. It's the result of refusing to suffer unnecessarily. And for the first time, Clara wasn't just surviving her life, she was inhabiting it. Julian didn't propose the way people expect. There was no crowded restaurant, no ring revealed under bright lights, no carefully staged moment designed for applause. In fact, there was nothing about the evening that suggested it would change Clara's life. They had spent the day apart. Clara wrapped up work late, her mind still half occupied with strategy notes and unanswered emails. When Julian suggested a walk through Central Park, she almost declined. She was tired, content, but tired. They walked in silence at first, the city softened by the evening air. Streetlights reflected off the pavement, and the noise of Manhattan faded into something distant and manageable. Julian matched her pace without comment. After a while, he stopped near a quiet stretch of path. "I've been thinking about something," he said. Clara turned toward him, curious but unguarded. Julian didn't reach for his pocket. He didn't kneel. He simply looked at her, steady and unhurried. "I know you don't need saving," he continued, "and I know you don't need anyone to complete you. That's exactly why I'm here." Clara felt her breath catch. "I don't want a life built on convenience or image," Julian said. "I want one built on choice, on respect, on waking up every day knowing we're moving forward together because we want to." He paused, giving her space. No pressure, no performance. "I choose you," he said simply. "If you choose me too." For a long moment, Clara couldn't speak. Not because she was overwhelmed, but because she was clear. There was no fear in her chest, no instinct to calculate risk or minimize her needs. She didn't feel like she was stepping into something uncertain. She felt like she was standing on solid ground. "Yes," she said softly. "I choose you." Julian smiled, not triumphant, not relieved, just present. He took her hand, warm and steady, and for the first time in years, Clara felt something she had never experienced in her previous marriage: certainty without anxiety. They didn't rush to announce it. They didn't tell the world that night. The moment belonged to them alone, held quietly between shared glances and unspoken understanding. As they continued walking, Clara realized the true significance of what had just happened. This wasn't a reward for surviving pain. It was a partnership formed after she had learned her worth. And that made all the difference. Clara didn't want a grand wedding. After everything she had lived through, spectacle felt unnecessary. She wasn't interested in proving anything to anyone. The life she had rebuilt didn't need witnesses to feel real. They chose a small ceremony in Central Park, early in the morning before the crowds arrived. The air was cool, the light soft, filtering through the trees like a quiet blessing. There were no photographers rushing for angles, no guests performing happiness. Just a few close friends, a simple arrangement of flowers, and the city breathing gently around them. Clara wore a dress that felt like herself. Understated, elegant, unforced. Julian stood beside her, calm and grounded, exactly as he always was. When they exchanged vows, their words weren't poetic or dramatic. They were honest, promises built on reality. As they spoke, Clara felt something settle deeply inside her. Not excitement, not relief, but completion. This wasn't the beginning of a fantasy. It was the continuation of a life she had chosen deliberately. After the ceremony, they lingered for a while, walking slowly through the park. A few strangers smiled at them, sensing something quietly joyful without knowing why. No one recognized Clara as Ethan's ex-wife. No one whispered. No one stared. She was free of that story. Later that day, news of the wedding traveled quietly through familiar circles. There were no announcements, no glossy photos, no captions designed to provoke envy. Just a fact passed from one person to another. Clara had remarried. Ethan heard about it weeks later. The information reached him second-hand, delivered without emphasis as if it barely mattered. He sat with it longer than he expected. There was no anger, no dramatic regret. Just a dull understanding that something final had happened without his involvement. Clara hadn't won by outshining him. She had won by moving on so completely that his presence was no longer required for her happiness. That night, Clara stood by the window of her new home, Julian's hand resting lightly at her back. The city lights stretched endlessly ahead, no longer symbols of pressure or expectation. They were simply possibilities. And for the first time, Clara understood the deepest truth of all. The most satisfying ending isn't watching someone else fall. It's realizing you've already risen, and they're no longer part of the view. Ethan Whitmore didn't realize he was alone until there was no one left to blame. The apartment felt different now, not emptier, just exposed. Without Vanessa's presence, without the constant noise of ambition and validation, the silence pressed in with uncomfortable clarity. Every sound echoed. Every thought lingered longer than it should have. He had once believed regret would come with drama. It didn't. It arrived quietly disguised as routine, a dinner eaten alone, a phone that stayed dark longer each night, invitations that stopped arriving without explanation. People hadn't turned against him. They had simply moved on. Ethan sat at his desk late one evening, scrolling through old files he no longer needed. Contracts that had expired, projects reassigned, notes scribbled hastily during meetings where his voice no longer carried weight. He stopped at one document and froze. It was Clara's. Not her name, but her structure. The way problems were framed, the clarity in the margins, the calm efficiency he had once dismissed as passivity. He read through it slowly, realization tightening in his chest. This was what he had walked away from, not just a marriage, not just a woman, a foundation. Ethan leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. For the first time, he allowed himself to replay the moment he had left, the way Clara had stood there, silent, absorbing the impact without protest. He had mistaken that silence for weakness. He had assumed she would remain where he left her. That assumption had cost him everything. He thought about the wedding he hadn't attended, the life she had built without him, the ease with which she had removed herself from his orbit. Clara hadn't fought him. She hadn't begged. She hadn't warned him. She had simply outgrown him. The realization stung more sharply than anger ever could. Ethan opened his phone and hovered over her name. For a moment he imagined sending a message. Something honest. Something regretful. An apology, perhaps, or an explanation that arrived far too late to matter. He didn't send it. Some doors close quietly, but permanently. Ethan understood now that regret doesn't demand attention. It waits patiently, settling in once all other distractions have faded. It stays when ambition fails and ego has nowhere left to hide. And as he sat alone with the full weight of his choices, one truth became impossible to ignore. Clara hadn't taken anything from him. He had given it away. Clara's happiness didn't announce itself. It showed up in ordinary moments that no one applauded. Morning light spilling across the kitchen floor, coffee brewed slowly, without urgency, the ease of sharing space with someone who didn't need her to shrink or perform. Life moved at a different pace now. On weekends, Clara and Julian walked through the city without a destination. Sometimes they talked about work. Sometimes they didn't talk at all. Silence no longer felt like something to fill. It felt like trust, the kind that doesn't require reassurance. Clara noticed how her body responded to this new life. Her shoulders stayed relaxed. Her thoughts felt ordered. Decisions came without the old undercurrent of anxiety. She no longer replayed conversations in her head, wondering if she had said too much or asked for too little. She had learned the difference between love and endurance. Happiness, she realized, wasn't loud. It didn't prove itself to anyone. It didn't need comparison or validation. It existed independently of who had wronged her or who had lost her. Occasionally memories surfaced, not painfully, but neutrally. A reminder of the woman she had been and the choices she had made with the information she had then. Clara didn't judge that version of herself anymore. She honored her. Without that woman's silence, this life wouldn't exist. One evening, as the city settled into twilight, Clara stood at the window watching the lights turn on one by one. Julian came up behind her, resting his hand lightly at her waist. No words were exchanged. None were needed. This was the reward. Not revenge, not recognition, not the satisfaction of watching someone else fall, but a life built on alignment. Clara had gained more than she lost, not because the world corrected itself, but because she had. She chose integrity over approval, clarity over comfort, growth over familiarity. And that choice had changed everything. Somewhere, people still told stories about what happened. They debated who was right, who was wrong, who won, who failed. Clara didn't participate. Those stories belonged to the past, to versions of her life that no longer applied. She had moved beyond the need for conclusions, because the truth was simple. When someone walks away from you too easily, they aren't rejecting your value. They're revealing their limits. And when you finally stop chasing what couldn't hold you, you make space for a life that can. That was Clara's ending. Quiet, earned, complete. And so, the story comes to a close. Now, let me ask you something, my wonderful friends. Are you still here with me right now? If you are, then something in this story must have touched your heart in a quiet, personal way. Because at its core, This wasn't just a story about betrayal or success. It was a story about dignity, about what happens when someone walks away from you too easily, and how that moment, painful as it is, can become the beginning of your freedom. The Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Clara didn't control what was done to her, but she controlled how she responded. She chose growth over bitterness, clarity over chaos, and peace over revenge. Another Stoic truth reminds us, the best revenge is not to be like your enemy. And maybe that's the most powerful lesson here. Healing doesn't need to be loud. Happiness doesn't need witnesses. Sometimes the greatest victory is simply building a life so aligned that the past no longer has access to you. If this story resonated with you, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps these stories reach others who may need them, right now, more than we realize. Thank you for being here.